Hey everyone, and welcome to this deep dive.
Yeah.
Today we're going to be cracking open a really fascinating book all about the 1918 influenza pandemic.
Oh, very cool.
Now, you might think, the story we've all heard about the 1918 flu,
Right.
but trust me, there's so much more to it than meets the eye. And one of the things that I found so interesting in this book was that it was especially brutal to young adults,
Yeah.
which is kind of counterintuitive, right?
Yeah, you would think that it would be the very old and the very young that would be most susceptible.
Yeah, exactly.
But no, this one really hit young adults hard.
Yeah, why them? That's just one of the many mysteries we'll be unpacking today with our expert who's going to help us navigate all of these sources.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it really speaks to just the unique nature of this pandemic,
Yeah.
What's interesting, too, is that this is all unfolding at a time of, radical change in medicine.
Yeah.
We're talking about the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a period when the scientific method was really becoming the gold standard.
Yeah, so let's set the stage here. Our sources talk about this pivotal moment, the launch of Johns Hopkins University in 1876.
Okay.
And Thomas Huxley, this super renowned English scientist, gave the keynote address. And he basically made the case for why the scientific method was so important.
Yeah.
He was arguing that it wasn't just about academics. This wasn't just something that was happening, in ivory towers.
Yeah.
It was like how society functions as a whole. Like everything from how we govern ourselves to how we, live our daily lives.
Right, and make decisions based on evidence rather than just,
Yeah.
Conjecture or tradition.
Exactly.
Yeah,
And Huxley was spot on about that.
absolutely. He was ahead of his time in a lot of ways.
Yeah. And so, before this shift, medicine had relied very heavily on logic and observation.
Right.
So doctors would, observe symptoms,
Right.
come up with theories based on those observations, and then try to deduce the cause and the treatment of an
Yeah.
illness.
But there was a problem with that.
Yeah, it wasn't always accurate. And I love this this
Yeah.
anecdote that's in our sources about this physicist named Leo Szilard
Oh, yeah.
who switched to biology
Okay.
and was completely thrown off.
Interesting.
Because he was so used to working in this field where pure reasoning was king, but biology constantly threw these curveballs at him.
Yeah.
It was why do I have to keep looking up facts?
Yeah.
I should just be able to reason my way to the answer,
Exactly.
which is so funny.
And that's a great illustration of how complex biology and medicine really are.
Totally.
Unlike physics, where you can often deduce your way to the answer.
Right.
In biology, you need that solid experimental evidence.
Yes.
You need to test your hypotheses.
Yeah.
And that was a huge shift in thinking,
Yeah.
And it's no wonder that there was pushback. I mean, even after the germ theory started gaining traction, there were still some very prominent scientists who remained skeptical.
Oh, yeah. The book mentions this crazy story about Max von Pettenkofer, who was this well-known scientist who flat out refused to believe in the germ theory.
Right.
And he was so convinced that cholera wasn't caused by bacteria that he drank a whole test tube of cholera bacteria to prove his point.
That's dedication to your theory.
I know.
Wow, what a way to go.
I know. Can you imagine?
Yeah, that's a dramatic example of just the clash between, old and new ideas in science.
Yeah.
The germ theory really challenged the prevailing beliefs about disease, like the miasma theory,
Yes.
which attributed illness to bad air.
It's so crazy to think about how people used to think that bad smells could make you sick.
Right.
If
Yeah.
it smells bad, it must be bad for you.
Yeah, exactly.
But, this germ theory was such a game changer.
It was revolutionary.
And a lot of this was thanks to these pioneers like Louis Pasteur, who demonstrated the role of microorganisms in fermentation. And then you have Joseph Lister, who applied these findings to antiseptic surgery. And then Robert Koch comes along, who definitively linked specific germs to specific diseases through his research on the anthrax bacillus.
Yes, his work was groundbreaking.
Yeah, and his work provided this concrete evidence that was needed to solidify the germ theory.
Exactly.
So we've got this backdrop of this monumental shift in scientific thought happening.
Right.
Into this arena steps our American hero, as the book calls him, William Welch.
Okay.
And the book really paints this incredible picture of him, starting as this young, insecure medical student, and then eventually becoming one of the most influential figures in American medicine.
That's quite a journey.
I know.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And Welch was this true champion of the scientific method.
He was all about bringing rigor and evidence to medicine.
Yes, and he was instrumental in establishing Johns Hopkins Hospital and its medical school as this leading research institution.
Right.
Creating this environment where collaboration and scientific inquiry could just thrive.
It was a hub for the best and brightest.
Yeah.
And then, get this, he was a key player in the Flexner Report,
Oh, wow.
which basically exposed these awful conditions in many medical schools at the time.
Yeah, that report was a bombshell.
It was.
It revealed that many medical schools were just substandard,
Yeah.
lacking proper facilities, qualified faculty, a rigorous curriculum.
Yeah, they were just handing out degrees to anyone.
Right. It was more like an apprenticeship than a real medical education.
Right.
Yeah. And so this report led to a complete overhaul of medical education in the U.S.
Yeah, it was a wake-up call
It was.
for the entire medical profession.
Yeah, it raised the bar for quality and scientific rigor.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it's hard to overstate Welch's impact on, the advancement of medicine in America.
He was a true visionary.
He was.
Yeah.
So we've got this revolution in medical science happening.
Right.
And then, bam, the 1918 influenza pandemic kind of explodes onto the scene.
It's like a perfect storm.
I know.
Yeah.
And it's crazy to think that this might have all started at Camp Funston in Kansas, where you had all these soldiers just packed together in, less than ideal conditions.
Yeah, that's a breeding ground for something like this.
Yeah, exactly.
Overcrowding and, probably not the best hygiene.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then, the presence of various diseases.
Right. A perfect recipe.
Like the perfect petri dish.
Yeah, exactly.
But to understand how it became a global pandemic,
Yeah.
we need to understand a little bit about how influenza viruses work.
Right.
So can you break it down for us? What makes these viruses so tricky?
Well, influenza viruses are these tiny little sneaky things that basically hijack your cells to make copies of themselves.
Yeah.
And they're constantly mutating, which makes them incredibly difficult to fight off.
Okay, so they're like little shapeshifters.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And our sources highlight two key processes,
Okay.
antigenic drift and antigenic shift.
Okay, I've heard of those.
Yeah. So drift is a gradual change in the virus over time.
Yep.
While shift is a sudden, dramatic change,
I get
like
it.
a whole new outfit. And shift is what usually leads to pandemics because it creates a virus that our immune systems have never encountered before.
It's like the virus is constantly changing its disguise.
Yes.
And then suddenly it's wearing like a completely new outfit that our bodies don't recognize.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the 1918 virus was a master of disguise.
Right.
The book tells this really intriguing story about a country doctor named Loring Minor in Haskell County, Kansas.
Okay.
And he was one of the first to encounter this particularly deadly strain of influenza.
Uh-huh.
And he was completely baffled by how severe the illness was.
Oh, wow.
And the unusual symptoms he was seeing, he knew something was seriously wrong.
Oh, no.
And he tried to sound the alarm,
Yeah.
but by then it was already too late.
Oh, this thing was about to go global, wasn't it?
Exactly. It was like a spark that ignited a wildfire.
Yeah.
Yeah, it really was. And the virus first spread through military camps and then hopped onto troop ships. And before you knew it, it was spreading like wildfire across the globe.
Yeah, that makes sense. You've got these massive troop movements.
Yeah.
Soldiers from all over the world mixing together and then returning home.
Exactly.
What a perfect recipe for a pandemic.
Right.
It's like the virus hitched a ride on the war,
Yeah,
spreading further and faster than it ever could have otherwise.
exactly. And as if that wasn't enough, there was a lot of censorship happening at the time.
Oh, really?
Governments didn't want to create panic or, hurt morale, so they downplayed the severity of the outbreak.
Wow. So even back then, governments were struggling with, how to communicate during a health crisis.
Yeah, it's a timeless challenge.
It makes you wonder if the things would have been different if people had known, the true extent of the danger from the start.
It's hard to say, but it certainly didn't help.
Yeah, it really highlights how important, clear and accurate information is,
Absolutely.
especially during times like these.
Transparency and trust are essential,
Yeah,
especially in public health emergencies.
totally. And initially, people weren't too worried because a lot of the early cases seemed like, just a mild 3-day fever.
Right.
So they just thought it was a bad flu.
Exactly.
Little did they know.
Yeah, the book really emphasizes how quickly things took a turn for the worse. That second wave was absolutely brutal.
It was.
People were dying at an alarming rate
Yeah.
from this incredibly aggressive form of pneumonia.
Yeah. And their skin would even turn blue.
Yeah, from lack of oxygen, a condition called cyanosis. Can
You
you imagine the fear and the panic that must have gripped people?
Oh, it must have been terrifying. And imagine being a scientist at that time,
Right.
facing this unknown enemy.
Yeah.
The sources describe this frantic race within the scientific community
Oh,
to
absolutely.
understand and fight this virus.
Yeah, there was a sense of urgency, like we've got to figure this out before it's too late.
Right. And you have all these brilliant minds, Rufus Cole Oswald, Avery William Park, and Anna Williams.
Yeah, these were giants in their fields.
They were all working tirelessly to develop vaccines and serums.
They were really on the cutting edge of science at the time.
It's incredible how much they were able to accomplish, especially considering the limited tools they had at their disposal.
Right. They didn't have the technology we have today,
Yeah,
but they were incredibly resourceful.
they were.
Yeah, and they were working against the clock.
And to make matters even more challenging, they were operating under the mistaken belief that Pfeiffer's bacillus, a type of bacteria we now know as Haemophilus influenza,
Right.
was the primary cause of the flu.
Yeah, that threw them off track for a while.
Yeah, it's a reminder that even the brightest minds can be misled
Absolutely.
by incomplete information.
Yeah, science is a process.
It
It's
is.
an ongoing journey of discovery, and
Right.
sometimes those discoveries take you down the wrong path before you find the right one.
Totally. So while all of this was going on, the scientists are scrambling to find a cure.
Right.
What's happening in the rest of the world? How is society coping with this pandemic?
Well, things were pretty chaotic.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Censorship and conflicting information led to a breakdown of trust in authorities.
Yeah, that's understandable.
Yeah.
I mean, imagine facing this deadly disease without knowing what caused it or how to protect yourself.
Right. It was a recipe for widespread fear and panic.
Yeah, it must have felt like the world was falling apart.
And unfortunately, there were some major leadership failures
Oh, well.
that compounded the crisis. Our sources really don't hold back in criticizing figures like Surgeon General Rupert Blue, whose inaction and inadequate public health measures had disastrous consequences.
It's heartbreaking to read about all the suffering that could have been prevented
Right.
with better leadership
Yeah.
and more coordinated action.
It's a stark reminder of the importance of strong public health infrastructure and effective leadership in times of crisis.
Yeah, and then you have these other communities that kind of took matters into their own hands.
Right.
In places like Philadelphia, where private organizations stepped up to provide care and support.
Yeah, that's really inspiring.
It's amazing to see how ordinary people can rise to the occasion
Yes.
and make a difference, even in the face of such overwhelming challenges.
It shows the strength of community and the human spirit.
It does.
Yeah.
So we've talked about, the scientific race for a cure and the societal impact of the pandemic.
Right.
But I'm curious, what about the long-term effects? Did things just kind of go back to normal once the pandemic subsided?
Not exactly. The 1918 pandemic left lasting scars, both physically and emotionally.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the book discusses how some survivors experienced chronic health problems,
Oh, wow.
like lung damage and heart disease, long after the virus had run its course.
So even if you survived the initial infection,
Mm-hmm.
you might still be dealing with the consequences for years to come.
That's right. And then there's the psychological toll. Imagine living through a time when millions of people around the world are dying, including your friends and family.
Yeah.
The book talks about how many survivors struggled with the trauma of losing loved ones. And witnessing such widespread suffering, the fear and grief must have been overwhelming.
Yeah, it's a reminder that the impact of a pandemic goes far beyond, the immediate crisis. It can
No.
cast a long shadow affecting people's lives and communities for generations.
Exactly. And then there's the question of President Woodrow Wilson.
Oh, yeah.
Your sources explore how his own bout with the flu during the Paris Peace Conference might have affected his decision-making,
Wow.
potentially altering the terms of the Treaty of Versailles and shaping the course of history.
That's incredible. It makes you wonder how different the world might be today if Wilson hadn't gotten sick.
It's a fascinating what-if scenario.
It is.
Yeah, that highlights the ripple effects of this pandemic reaching far beyond the realm of public health.
That's mind-blowing stuff.
It is, and we've only scratched the surface here. This book is packed with fascinating details and insights.
I know. I'm already hooked. What else is there to uncover in this story?
Yeah.
It feels like we've gone so deep into this pandemic already.
Uh,
I'm ready for more. What other fascinating details did you uncover in our sources?
Well, one thing that really struck me was that the virus wasn't limited to humans. It also infected animals,
What?
particularly pigs.
Oh, wow. So this pandemic was like jumping between species.
It was, and it's actually a recurring theme in influenza pandemics. You know, it really highlights how interconnected human and animal health truly are.
Right.
The book mentions this veterinarian named J.S. Kuhn,
Okay.
who observed this flu outbreak in pigs during the pandemic,
Uh-huh.
and he was convinced that it was the same flu that was killing humans.
Wow.
But, you know, many farmers and other vets dismissed his claims.
Really?
They didn't want to believe that their livestock could be carrying this deadly disease.
That's a classic example of how, economic interest can sometimes cloud our judgment,
Yeah, absolutely.
even when lives are at stake.
Right.
It makes you wonder how many outbreaks could have been prevented or contained
Right.
if we were more proactive about monitoring animal health.
It's a crucial point. And it wasn't until decades later that scientists were able to prove that swine influenza was indeed closely related to the 1918 human flu.
Wow.
So it goes to show that scientific understanding evolves over time.
Yeah.
And sometimes the answers we're looking for take years, even decades to uncover.
And speaking of scientific understanding,
Yeah.
our sources talk about how scientists spent years trying to figure out why the 1918 flu was so much more deadly than other flu strains.
Right.
They knew the virus itself was aggressive, but they suspected that there were other factors at play.
Exactly. It was like a puzzle they were trying to piece together.
Yeah.
And one theory that emerged was that the virus triggered this overreaction of the immune system.
Oh, so it's like the body's defenses went haywire,
Exactly.
causing this massive inflammatory response in the lungs.
Right. And this is what's known as a cytokine storm.
Okay.
And it can lead to severe lung damage and respiratory failure.
So instead of fighting off the virus, the
Yeah.
body was actually attacking itself.
In a way, yes. And what's even more tragic is that this cytokine storm explains why young, healthy people with robust immune systems were hit particularly hard.
Oh, wow.
Their strong immune responses actually backfired on them.
That's both fascinating and terrifying.
It is.
It means that what's normally a good thing,
Mm-hmm.
a strong immune system can actually become a liability
Right, exactly.
in certain situations.
It's a sobering reminder that even our own bodies can sometimes become our worst enemies.
Yeah.
And on top of this, the book explores another theory that the virus itself was unusually efficient at evading the immune system.
So it was like a double whammy.
Yes.
A virus that could sneak past the body's defenses and then trigger this devastating overreaction.
That's the idea, and some researchers believe that the virus's unique genetic makeup allowed it to spread rapidly and infect a wider range of cells than typical flu viruses.
Wow.
So this enhanced infectivity combined with the immune system overreaction, created this perfect storm of lethality.
Yeah, and our sources don't shy away from describing how horrific the symptoms were.
No, they were truly gruesome.
People were literally drowning in their own fluids as their lungs filled with blood and pus.
Yeah. It was a brutal and terrifying way to die.
Yeah, and the speed with which people succumbed to the illness was shocking.
I know some were healthy in the morning and dead by nightfall.
Oh my gosh.
Imagine the fear and helplessness that must have pervaded society.
It's truly heartbreaking. The book describes how entire families were wiped out, leaving countless orphans in their wake.
Yeah, the human cost of this pandemic is immeasurable.
It really is. And then there were the social and economic consequences. Businesses shut down, transportation systems ground to a halt,
Yeah.
and hospitals are just overwhelmed with the sick and the dying.
It was a complete societal breakdown.
Yeah, it's clear that the 1918 flu wasn't just a passing event. It was like a watershed moment in history.
Absolutely.
And it's not just the immediate impact that we need to consider.
Right.
Our sources emphasize the long-term consequences of the pandemic.
Absolutely. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I think it's crucial to acknowledge the enduring relevance of the 1918 flu pandemic.
Yeah.
It's a stark reminder of the ever-present threat posed by infectious diseases.
Absolutely. We can't afford to be complacent. We've come a long way in our understanding of viruses and our ability to develop vaccines and treatments.
Right.
But as we've seen with more recent pandemics, we're still vulnerable to these microscopic enemies.
We are, and we need to learn from the past, both its triumphs and its tragedies, to better prepare ourselves for the challenges that lie ahead.
This deep dive has been incredible. It's left me with a profound sense of awe for the resilience of the human spirit and a renewed appreciation for the importance of science, public health, and global collaboration.
I couldn't agree more, and if you're looking to delve deeper into this compelling and relevant piece of history, be sure to check out the affiliate link in the show notes to purchase the book.
We highly recommend it. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay healthy.